It begins with a confession. "My fault, my greatest fault," wrote Olga Lengyel. Her story opens not in triumph, but in remorse, a woman confronting the weight of choices made under deceit. This is not the tale of a heroine who conquered evil. It is the chronicle of an ordinary human being caught in a system designed to make compassion lethal. Olga's voice survived the camps not to soothe us, but to remind us what happens when decency surrenders to obedience. In 1944, Transylvania was a territory shuffled like a card between nations. The war had eaten its borders, its language, and its safety. Cluj, Olga's city, lay under Hungarian rule aligned with Nazi Germany. She and her husband, Dr. Miklos Lengyel, ran a small private hospital. White tiles, polished instruments, the antiseptic smell of order amid chaos. Their two young sons, Arvad and Thomas, raced through the corridors after lessons. Olga's parents tended the household. Even as soldiers patrolled the streets and neighbors disappeared, the family clung to normal routines. Dinner at 7, letters to friends, optimism as defense. Rumors filtered in from Poland, ghettos emptied, trains that never came back, labor camps that swallowed thousands. Olga dismissed them as wartime exaggerations. Humanity, she believed, might be cruel, but not industrially cruel. Civilization had rules, it had hospitals, it had music. The mind resists horror until horror stands on its doorstep. That doorstep arrived with a knock. 2 uniformed policemen requested the doctor's presence for routine questioning. He went calmly, still in his white coat. Hours passed. He did not return. When news came, it was wrapped in deceit. He would be sent to Germany to work in a hospital. The Reich valued skilled surgeons, they said. His wife could accompany him if she wished. Families were kept together. The tone was courteous, the trap invisible. Olga begged her parents to join them. Separation felt unthinkable. Her father sensed danger. "You do not take children into war," he warned. But the officials smiled and insisted it was temporary relocation. Within an hour, the family packed essentials, documents, jewels, winter clothes, and locked their door for what they thought was a short absence. At the station, instead of passenger coaches, they found cattle cars. 96 souls crammed into a space built for 8 horses, a single bucket for waste, another for water. When the doors slammed, the air vanished. Inside, panic had no room to unfold. Children cried until they lost their voices. The elderly collapsed. By night, breath turned the air to steam. By day, heat suffocated them. Guards shouted from outside, demanding watches and rings in exchange for another pail of water. Olga's younger boy, lips split with thirst, refused his share so that older passengers could drink. By the 3rd day, bodies piled against the walls. A father died beside his son. The guard mocked them. "Keep your corpse, you'll have more soon." 7 days later, the train screeched to a halt. When the doors slid open, light stabbed their eyes. Cold air carried the smell of burning fat and chlorine. Men in striped uniforms shouted orders they barely understood. Floodlights, barbed wire, towers, dogs. A sign, "Arbeit macht frei," work makes you free. They had reached AuschwitzBirkenau, the factory of death disguised as discipline. On the ramp, families fractured within minutes, men one way, women another, luggage to a heap already taller than a house. An SS doctor, later Olga would learn his name, Fritz Klein, gestured lazily with a gloved hand, right for temporary labor, left for immediate extermination. Her younger son went left with the children. Her mother stepped forward to accompany him. Klein asked of the older boy, "Is he over 12? "No," Olga said quickly, thinking she was saving him from heavy work. That lie condemned him. A soldier smiled. "You'll see them again soon." She never did. The new arrivals were ordered to strip. Hair was shaved, jewelry torn away. The naked were mocked and beaten. After the showers, real water this time, they were thrown rags, dresses ripped from corpses, shoes without laces, a red stripe painted down the back. They stood outside, shivering, while their names were replaced by numbers. A sweet, sickening smoke drifted from 5 tall chimneys. Someone whispered, "That's the bakery." Olga wanted to believe it. She would soon learn that those chimneys baked only flesh. Barrack 26 was built for horses, not humans. Its walls were warped by frost, its floor packed with filth, its roof full of holes that let in rain and snow alike. 1,500 women were crammed inside, 3 tiers of bunks along each wall, planks of wood stacked like boxes, each meant to hold 4 but holding 20. There were no mattresses, no straw, only splinters and the bodies of strangers pressed together for warmth. 2 blankets for 10 people, both damp, both crawling with lice. At night, women fought quietly for a few inches of space. In the dark, whispers became sobs, sobs became silence. Morning arrived with a whistle before dawn. The women stumbled outside barefoot, clothed in rags that barely covered them, shivering in lines of 5. Roll call lasted hours, sometimes until noon. Guards counted, miscounted, and counted again, amused by the sight of thousands freezing in formation. The dead were laid at the front of the row, even corpses were made to attend. If one prisoner was missing, the rest stood until she was found. Punishment was collective. It taught everyone to hate the one who failed. Division was the first rule of control. Breakfast was a cup of brown liquid called coffee. It was burnt water with a hint of bitterness, nothing more. Lunch was a soup of rotting vegetables and turnip leaves, sometimes an entire beet sliced into 40 portions, sometimes worms floating on top. Dinner was 6 ounces of black bread heavy with sawdust, a smear of margarine, occasionally a cube of something resembling meat. Hunger stopped being a feeling and became an organ inside the body, always aching, always louder than thought. Disease grew faster than weeds, typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, all untreated. When someone died, her clothing was stripped for reuse. The living wore the dead without knowing their names. The barrack reeked of rot, sweat, and fear. Yet amid that despair, women still found ways to comfort one another. A stranger's hand pressed into yours in the night meant, "You're still here, I see you." In a place built to erase humanity, even a whisper of kindness became rebellion. Olga kept herself alive through small acts of order. She cleaned the planks with rags torn from her dress. She inventoried the faces around her, names, ages, hometowns, memorizing them so that if she survived, she could testify that they had lived. Memory was resistance. Forgetting was victory for the murderers. She learned to tie her shoes with string scavenged from corpses. She learned to breathe shallowly to avoid the stench. She learned never to speak of her sons aloud. Grief was dangerous. Grief made you slow, and slowness was fatal. The camp was not chaos. It was organization turned insane. Schedules, numbers, records, German efficiency applied to death. Each transport was logged, each selection tabulated, each corpse converted to ash, each gram of gold from teeth recorded. Bureaucracy was the final cruelty. Even annihilation had paperwork. Olga later wrote, "They killed us with logic." The murder was methodical, not emotional. Emotion, after all, would have required seeing the victims as human beings. One afternoon, while working in a tool shed, Olga met Irka, the block elder, a tall, sharp-eyed Polish woman who had survived 4 years in Birkenau. Irka laughed bitterly when Olga said she hoped to see her family again. "You think they let mothers and children live together?" she asked. "Look at the smoke." "That is them." Her voice was neither cruel nor gentle. It was the voice of someone long past illusion. That night, Olga lay on the planks, staring upward at the leaking roof. The truth settled like lead inside her chest. The next morning she woke different, hollow but determined. She could not die yet. She owed the dead her memory. Roll calls continued. Punishments multiplied. Some women stopped speaking altogether. Others told stories of their old lives in whispers, cafes in Budapest, children's names, gardens, husbands, the taste of coffee with real milk. They spoke not to remember happiness, but to remind themselves they had once been people. Olga began to notice the pattern of survival. Those who could still imagine something beyond the wire lasted longer. Those who surrendered to despair were gone within weeks. The women sometimes sang softly in the evenings, forbidden songs in broken harmony. A Czech lullaby drifted through the darkness. The melody made guards angry. They ordered silence. Yet even in silence, the song lingered. In that camp, music was not entertainment, it was defiance. Every note said, "We are still alive, even if you deny it." Days blurred into one another until time lost shape. The seasons were marked only by how the air hurt, in summer with heat and stench, in winter with frost and silence. Olga began to measure days not by calendars but by roll calls, by the number of women missing from the line each morning. Sometimes a friend who slept beside her simply did not wake. The body beside her would be still, stiff, already cooling. No one screamed. They just shifted to make room. Death was ordinary, and that ordinariness was its horror. Each day brought new transports. The trains came endlessly, each one packed with faces looking out from cracks in the boards. Olga watched from a work detail near the ramp, her stomach hollow with dread. New arrivals stepped down, clutching children, clutching hope. The guards barked. The selections began. She recognized the same gestures, the same false calm, the same lies told in soothing voices. To the showers. You'll get soup after. You'll be reunited. They were still perfecting the choreography of deception. Watching it, she realized that Auschwitz was not just a camp. It was a factory of lies that produced corpses. Once, while repairing surgical instruments in the camp hospital, Olga was summoned to assist a German doctor. She thought for a moment that her training as a nurse might help her save someone. Instead, she found herself holding a child while he injected poison into its arm. The boy convulsed and went still. Olga's hands shook. The doctor said, "You see, painless," and walked away. She cleaned the syringe and whispered to herself, "Remember this. Do not let them bury this in silence." From that day, she vowed to live, not for herself, but as evidence. The hospital block, ironically, was worse than most others. It reeked of gangrene and carbolic acid. Prisoners were used for experiments, sterilizations, amputations, transfusions, all under the banner of science. The doctors took notes while their patients screamed. Once, she saw a colleague, another Hungarian woman forced to assist, collapse mid-operation. The SS officer laughed and said, "The subject can replace her." And so they did. The living operated on the dying, and the dying became the next lesson. Rumors drifted through the camp like fragile sparks of light. Someone whispered that the Allies had landed in France. Another said the Russians were advancing from the east. Olga did not dare believe it, but even rumor changed how people breathed. For a day or two, the air felt lighter. Then came a new selection, and the light vanished again. During one of those selections, the SS men walked slowly down the line, pointing right or left. Women pinched color into their cheeks, bit their lips until they bled, stood as tall as they could. Olga coached those beside her. Smile. Look strong. Breathe steadily. A cough could mean death. A limp could mean death. Nothing was predictable except the randomness of cruelty. The chosen were marched away, their backs straight, trying not to look behind them. When the truck started, no one cried. They just waited until the sound faded, then returned to work. In that world, grief had to be silent to survive. One evening, a storm rolled over the camp, lightning flashing against the barbed wire. For a moment, the sky lit up so bright that Olga could see the outline of the chimneys glowing orange. The smoke twisted upward like fingers. She thought of her mother, her boys, her husband, all swallowed by that fire. The guilt struck her again, an endless echo. She wrote later, "I wanted to spare him from hard work, and with this, I killed him." That sentence became both her confession and her strength. It forced her to remember that deception, not malice, had delivered them. The Nazis had turned her love into a weapon against herself. Still, within the camp, traces of human warmth persisted. A woman shared a crumb of bread on Olga's birthday. Another risked her life to trade a piece of soap for a needle so that they could mend torn clothes. Such small gestures, measured against the vastness of death, might seem meaningless, but they were proof that compassion was not extinct. "We were shadows," Olga wrote, "yet within us the spark of humanity still glowed." At night, conversations turned to imagination. Women described the colors of their kitchens, the smell of lilacs in the spring, the taste of apples, the sound of rain on a real roof. They constructed home from memory. The guards could take everything but the mind. Even inside hell, people dreamed of ordinary life. Then, one day, Olga was ordered to accompany a medical officer to another block. On the way, she passed a heap of children's clothes still warm from the gas chambers. Tiny shoes, small dresses, a doll missing an arm. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. That night she realized she had not cried in months. The body learns to survive by numbing its heart. Only after liberation would the tears return, too late to wash anything clean. Every night smoke rose from the 5 chimneys, glowing red against the darkness. The flames reflected in the puddles, so that even the ground seemed to burn. The prisoners called them the 5 Sisters. They whispered prayers not to God, but to the smoke, carry our names where no one can erase them. The rhythm of cruelty became predictable, almost mechanical. Wake, roll call, work, count, beatings, sleep, repeat. Olga felt her identity fading, replaced by instinct. She was no longer wife or mother or nurse. She was hunger, she was cold, she was a body that refused to die. Yet even stripped to the core, she still observed, memorized, recorded in her mind every detail, the face of each guard, the sound of the siren, the names shouted during selection. She knew one day she would have to become the voice for those who never left this place. Her barrack chief, Urka, both tormentor and reluctant protector, sometimes spoke of life before the war. In those moments, the mask of authority slipped. She had been a factory worker, a mother of 3. 2 were dead, 1 missing. "We are all dead here," she said once. "Some just take longer to stop breathing." Olga never forgot that line. It captured the essence of Birkenau. Death stretched over time, disguised as survival. Work in the camp varied between absurd and lethal. Some days they carried stones from one end of the yard to the other and back again, labor without purpose, designed only to break spirit. Other days they cleaned the barracks of dead bodies, the stench clinging to their hair and skin. Olga learned to breathe through her mouth and stare straight ahead. The human mind, she discovered, could adjust to anything except hope, denied too many times. One morning, a truck arrived carrying a load of corpses from another block. The women were ordered to unload them. Olga lifted an arm and recognized the bracelet she had once given to a nurse she trained years before. The shock almost made her drop the body. That night, she hid the bracelet under her plank, a relic, a silent proof that the dead had once been alive and loved. New transports continued to pour in. Sometimes the guards ordered the women of Barrack 26 to sort through the clothes of those who had gone to the showers. The piles contained everything: baby shoes, photographs, letters, wedding rings. The women searched for items that could be reused. Olga found her son's coat among them one day. She knew it by the patch she had sewn on the sleeve. She held it to her face until a guard tore it away. After that, she stopped looking into the piles. The hierarchy of prisoners was a system of corruption. Some block elders beat others to earn small privileges: an extra slice of bread, a pair of socks. Some tried to help when they could. Olga refused to judge them later. "In hell," she wrote, "morality bends to survival." She saw women who had once been teachers, singers, and nurses reduced to animals fighting for a spoon. Yet she also saw them share that spoon when it mattered. Punishment was everywhere. A woman caught stealing potato peels was made to kneel for 6 hours on gravel while guards poured cold water over her until she froze. Another was forced to carry a rock above her head until her arms gave out. She collapsed and was beaten until she stopped moving. The prisoners watched without expression. Sympathy was forbidden. To react was to join the victim. At dusk, the camp changed color. Smoke turned crimson in the fading sun, and the smell of burning filled every breath. Even the birds avoided the sky above the chimneys. Some nights, wind blew ashes across the yard like snow. The women brushed them from their faces, knowing what they were. That silent knowledge was heavier than any whip. Olga sometimes dreamt of her hospital in Cluj, the bright lamps, the smell of ether, her husband's voice saying, "Steady hands." She would wake with her fists clenched, the dream dissolving into the stench of the barrack. To stay sane, she began repeating to herself a phrase she had once told her patients: "Breathe." One breath at a time, it became her prayer. She measured survival not in days, but in breaths. In rare moments of relative calm, prisoners told each other stories. One woman described Vienna's opera house, another, a bakery in Krakow, another, her wedding day. Olga listened as though she were collecting relics of a vanished world. Each story reminded her that these were not numbers, but lives, lives with mornings, smells, voices, and dreams. The Nazis could erase their bodies, but not their essence. She stored every detail in memory, promising to rebuild them with words if she survived. Then came a night of confusion, alarms, shouting, running feet. Rumors raced through the blocks. The Russians were near, the SS preparing to destroy evidence. Olga saw trucks loaded with files, guards burning papers. Flames leapt high as officers fed documents into bonfires. For the first time since her arrival, she saw fear on their faces. The invincible masters were afraid. That sight gave her strength. If they can fear, she thought, then they can fall. The next morning, they were ordered to pack. No one knew where they would go. Some whispered about another camp deeper inside Germany. Others said the SS planned to blow up the barracks. Olga had no energy left for speculation. She hid her small poison capsule again in her shoe, her final control over her fate. That day's roll call was the longest yet. Snow fell as the women stood motionless. Guards screamed for order. Dogs barked wildly. Columns of prisoners began marching toward the gate. Olga stayed still, pretending illness. She let herself fall to the ground, unmoving. A guard kicked her, assumed she was dead, and left her behind. It was chance, or destiny, or both. She would live because she looked like a corpse. When Olga opened her eyes again, the camp was quieter than she had ever heard it. The columns of prisoners had marched away through the snow, their footsteps fading into distance. The sky was a dull white, and flakes fell soundlessly onto the empty yard. The chimneys still smoked, but less now, as though even the fire was tired. She lay on the frozen ground, afraid to move, afraid it might all be a trick. Hours passed before she dared to lift her head. Birkenau was not empty yet. A few figures crept between barracks, too weak, too sick to have joined the evacuation. They moved like ghosts, scavenging scraps of wood or frozen bread crusts. The SS guards had fled, leaving chaos behind. A handful of capos still tried to give orders, but no one listened. The walls of authority had cracked overnight. The empire of death was collapsing on itself. Olga stumbled back into Barrack 26. The room smelled of sickness and smoke. Half the bunks were empty. The others held bodies curled under thin blankets. Those who could still speak whispered the same question. Is it over? No one answered. They had learned not to trust hope. 2 days later, the rumble of engines came from the east. At first they thought it was another transport, but the sound grew louder, steadier, unfamiliar. Through the mist appeared tanks painted with red stars. Soldiers in long coats entered the gate cautiously, rifles ready. They stopped when they saw what was inside. Their faces changed, shock, disbelief, nausea. One soldier crossed himself and wept openly. Another removed his cap and stood motionless. Liberation had come, but it looked nothing like salvation. The surviving prisoners did not run to greet them. They were too weak. Some fell to their knees, others simply stared. A few reached out trembling hands, unsure whether these men were real. The soldiers tried to speak, but words failed. Language was not built for what they saw. Skeletal figures wrapped in rags, eyes sunken, mouths cracked, bodies trembling between life and death. The living were indistinguishable from the dead. Olga remembered that moment as both an ending and a beginning. We were free, she wrote, but freedom was an emptiness. The ones I loved were not there to share it. She sat down in the snow and felt neither joy nor relief, only a vast silence where her heart used to be. Around her, women laughed, cried, fainted. The soldiers moved carefully, afraid to touch them for fear of breaking them. After days of chaos, the Soviets organized medical tents. Food was distributed, but the survivors' stomachs had shrunk. Many died from eating too quickly. Doctors and nurses tried to help, yet their hands shook. They had never treated patients who looked like this, human beings reduced to bones and memories. Olga volunteered to assist, though she could barely stand. She cleaned wounds, fed water to those who could not lift their heads, and whispered the same words again and again. "You're alive. You're alive." Sometimes they were, sometimes not. In the weeks after liberation, she began searching. She walked through ruins, through lists of names posted on church walls, through refugee camps filled with hollow-eyed strangers. She searched for her husband, for her parents, for her sons. No one had seen them. Every new list was a new wound. Eventually she accepted what she had known all along, that she was alone. Her family was ash scattered over the fields of Birkenau. Still she kept walking. The habit of survival was stronger than grief. She reached Krakow, then Budapest, then finally Romania. Each city was a ruin. Trains carried refugees in both directions, searching for homes that no longer existed. Olga had no home to return to. Her hospital was gone, her house occupied, her citizenship uncertain. She lived on borrowed beds, speaking little, eating less, but her mind was restless. The world outside wanted to move on, and that terrified her. She saw how quickly memory fades when it is painful. She decided to fight forgetting with testimony. In the spring of 1946, she began to write. At first, the sentences came haltingly, her hands trembling from malnutrition. She wrote on scraps of paper, on the backs of hospital forms, on anything she could find. The words were not polished, they were raw, like wounds reopening. "I must tell it," she wrote, "because those who cannot speak deserve a voice." Each night she relived the camp, the sounds, the smells, the faces, and poured them onto the page. Writing was not therapy, it was exorcism. She titled the manuscript 5 Chimneys, 5 for the crematoria that had burned without pause, turning human life into smoke that drifted across the Polish sky. The title was simple, factual, terrible. She did not embellish, she did not dramatize, the truth was enough. When she finished, she felt no relief, only exhaustion. She had kept her promise to remember. The book was published in 1947. At first, few wanted to read it. The world was busy rebuilding, eager for optimism, but slowly the testimony spread. In France, in America, in Israel, survivors recognized their own story in hers. Historians cited her details. Educators used her words. Letters arrived from readers who had lost entire families. One letter came from Albert Einstein. He thanked her for giving voice to the ones who are now silent and most forgotten. She kept that letter folded in her Bible for the rest of her life. In the years that followed, Olga's life moved between continents but never far from memory. She emigrated first to France, then later to the United States, carrying with her the manuscript that would outlive every border. Each time she unpacked her suitcase, the past came with it. She lectured in schools, spoke in churches, appeared at universities, and each time someone asked the same question. "How did you survive?" Her answer never changed. "By accident," she said. Survival, for her, was not victory, it was an unfinished duty. In New York, she founded the Memorial Library and Educational Foundation for the Study of the Holocaust. Its purpose was not to glorify suffering, but to analyze it, to teach that genocide is not an eruption of madness, but a product of systems, of bureaucracy, of obedience. She told her students that Auschwitz did not begin with gas chambers. It began with words. It began with the normalization of cruelty, the polite exclusion of neighbors, the shrug of indifference. "Every Holocaust," she said, "starts with silence." Her lectures were quiet, deliberate, factual. She did not shout, she did not dramatize. She trusted that the truth, simply told, was unbearable enough. When she described the Chimneys, her voice did not tremble. When she spoke of her children, her face remained calm. It was not coldness, it was precision. Emotion could distort memory, and she refused to let that happen. Her discipline was her revenge. Reporters sometimes tried to extract sensational details from her, asking for gruesome anecdotes. She refused. "If they do not believe the numbers, they will not believe the horror," she said. She focused instead on the mechanisms, how orders were given, how propaganda disguised murder as duty, how ordinary people adapted to barbarity. She wanted her listeners to recognize themselves in the perpetrators, not to excuse them, but to understand how easily morality collapses when fear becomes habit. Olga also spoke about the women who had helped one another in Birkenau, the secret networks of compassion that allowed fragments of dignity to survive. She told of Irka, who shared her last piece of bread with a dying girl, of Marta, who smuggled soap from the infirmary, of the nameless prisoner who whispered prayers over the dead even when she no longer believed in God. If there was grace in that place, Olga said, it lived in those small acts. Each story countered the idea that the camp had erased all humanity. To remember cruelty without also remembering courage would be another injustice. By the 1950s, her book had been translated into more than a dozen languages. School curriculums began to include excerpts. Survivors wrote to her saying that her words had given them permission to speak at last. Yet fame brought no comfort. She lived modestly, avoiding the spotlight. When asked why she continued to revisit her trauma, she replied, "Because denial grows in silence, and silence grows in comfort." She feared the world's short memory more than she feared her nightmares. At night, those nightmares still came. In one, she was back on the ramp, hearing the whistle of the train and seeing her children walking away. In another, she saw smoke curling above the chimneys, forming words she could not read. She would wake drenched in sweat, whispering apologies to the ghosts that followed her. Yet by morning she dressed neatly, brewed coffee, and began writing letters, always organized, always composed. Routine was her armor. She visited Auschwitz again in the 1960s, this time as a guest of historians. The camp was a museum then, its buildings preserved in quiet dignity. Tourists walked where she had crawled. She stood before the ruins of Crematorium II, the ground still littered with fragments of bone. For a long time she said nothing. Finally she turned to the guide and said, "Do you hear it?" The guide shook his head. "Exactly," she replied. "That is what frightens me, the silence." That visit deepened her conviction that education was the only safeguard. She began to speak not only about what had happened, but why it had happened, how propaganda dehumanizes, how citizens look away, how ordinary institutions cooperate. She showed that genocide is not chaos, it is order turned upside down. "They killed us," she said, "with organization." Every listener felt the chill of recognition. Her message spread beyond Holocaust remembrance. Civil rights activists, anti-war movements, even medical ethicists quoted her words. She became a symbol of the idea that bearing witness is not an act of mourning, but an act of defense. The past, she insisted, is not past until it stops repeating itself. Despite her composure, she never escaped the wound of guilt. In interviews late in life, when asked about her sons, her voice would falter only once. "I lied," she would say, "and my lie killed them." It was the same confession that had begun her story, repeated across decades, as if by repetition she could one day be forgiven. But forgiveness, she believed, belonged only to the dead. Still, she kept teaching. She trained educators, supported young writers, and funded projects that explored human rights abuses around the world. She wanted students to connect Auschwitz to Cambodia, to Rwanda, to Bosnia, to understand that the pattern was universal. "We build the same chimneys," she said, "whenever we stop seeing our neighbor's face." Her health declined slowly in the 1990s, but her work never ceased. In her last recorded speech, given from her hospital bed, she said softly, "Memory must be militant. If it sleeps, it dies." Those words became the motto of the foundation she left behind. When she passed away in 2001, former students lit candles not in mourning but in gratitude. The woman who had once emerged from ashes had kept her promise. She had turned remembrance into resistance. Even in death, Olga's story refused to close. Her voice continued to echo through classrooms, libraries, and documentaries. Students who never lived through war read her words and felt the chill of a history that might return if neglected. Historians praised her precision. Survivors thanked her for preserving their truth. Yet the book remained more than a memoir. It was a warning disguised as testimony. "The real horror," Olga had written, is not that man can kill man, but that he can do it with calm, bureaucratic efficiency. Her foundation published educational materials that challenged young people to identify early signs of dehumanization in their own societies. Teachers used 5 Chimneys not as a story of the past, but as a mirror for the present. In one lesson, students were asked to trace the steps that led to Auschwitz: prejudice, propaganda, exclusion, legislation, confiscation, isolation, extermination. The pattern was disturbingly logical. Evil had not appeared overnight. It had evolved by small increments, each one tolerated by those who preferred comfort to conscience. Olga's approach to teaching was grounded in empathy, not shock. She knew that terror alone could numb the mind. Instead, she emphasized choices, the moments when ordinary people had the chance to resist and did not. She told her audiences that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to obey it. She quoted from her own experience, "I feared death every hour, yet I feared silence more." The room would fall silent after those words. In her later years, she became a mentor to writers and artists grappling with the legacy of genocide. She encouraged them to explore without sensationalism, to let truth carry its own weight. "Do not invent horror," she advised. "Describe the absence of love, and horror will appear by itself." Her advice shaped an entire generation of Holocaust literature. As time passed, some began to question whether such memories should still be retold. The world was changing. New conflicts, new technologies, new distractions filled the headlines. Olga anticipated this fatigue. In one interview, she said, "When the last survivor dies, the murderers will have their second victory, the victory of forgetting." She dedicated her final decade to ensuring that would never happen. The memorial library she founded grew into an international network. Scholars studied not only Nazi ideology, but the psychology of obedience, the sociology of discrimination, the language of propaganda. The goal was not to dwell on death, but to recognize its seeds. Olga often said, "Genocide begins with grammar." By that she meant that when people start speaking of others as vermin or disease, the killing has already begun in words. Visitors to her lectures often expected grief. Instead, they found discipline. She would begin with facts, numbers, dates, maps, then slowly lead into stories. The combination of precision and humanity made her impossible to ignore. "Emotion fades," she explained, "but detail endures." She wanted her students to remember exactly how the system worked so that if they saw it rise again, they would recognize it before it was too late. One of her most powerful lectures ended with a question rather than a statement. She asked, "If tomorrow you were told to hate your neighbor, what would you need to hear to believe it?" The question hung in the air, uncomfortable, unanswerable. That discomfort was her goal. She believed awareness began where comfort ended. Her private life remained modest. She lived alone in a small apartment surrounded by books and photographs. On her desk sat a single-framed picture of her sons, taken before the war. The edges were worn from her fingers tracing their faces. Each morning she greeted them aloud, "Good morning, my darlings." "I am still speaking for you." Friends who visited described her as elegant, composed, and endlessly curious. She read widely, history, poetry, philosophy, and believed that knowledge was the only antidote to hate. Despite her public recognition, Olga never considered herself heroic. "Heroism," she said, "belongs to those who died refusing to lie." Her role, she insisted, was not courage but endurance. She carried guilt like a companion, but she transformed it into purpose. "If my lie killed them," she wrote, "then my truth must keep them alive." That sentence encapsulates her entire legacy. Toward the end of her life, filmmakers approached her to adapt her book into a documentary. She agreed on one condition: no dramatizations, no actors, no music meant to manipulate. Only facts, photographs, and her own voice reading excerpts. "If truth cannot move them," she said, "artifice will only insult the dead." The resulting film, sparse and haunting, became one of the earliest visual records of a survivor's unfiltered testimony. When it premiered, Olga sat quietly in the back row. As her recorded voice filled the theatre, she closed her eyes. On the screen, images of the camp appeared: barracks, wire, the empty sky. The audience did not applaud at the end, they simply sat in silence. A few wept. Olga later said that was the only appropriate reaction. Silence, she said, is the sound of understanding. After the screening, a young woman approached her, trembling. "How can you still believe in people?" she asked. Olga smiled faintly. "Because I have seen the worst of them," she said, "and still I found kindness. If even one hand reached out in that darkness, then humanity is not lost." The young woman began to cry. Olga took her hand and whispered, "Then remember. That is all I ask." Decades after the war, Olga's work inspired not only remembrance but reform. She collaborated with sociologists studying collective trauma and how societies process guilt. She argued that memory must not freeze into monuments. It must act as conscience. "We build statues," she said, "when we want to stop thinking. But remembrance must stay alive, not carved in stone." She preferred classrooms to ceremonies, questions to answers. In those classrooms, she often asked her students to imagine ordinary days under tyranny. What would you do if your friend stopped greeting you because the law said he was unclean? What if your employer asked for proof of ancestry? What if your newspaper told you that patriotism meant silence? The students hesitated, uncomfortable, unsure. Olga would nod. "That hesitation," she said, "is the crack where evil enters." She believed moral collapse begins not with brutality but with convenience. Her insights reached beyond the Holocaust. Human rights lawyers cited her when documenting atrocities in Latin America. Psychologists used her testimony to understand survivor guilt. Artists painted her face beside broken chimneys as a symbol of endurance. She watched all this recognition with detachment. "They admire the survivor," she said, "because they have forgotten what survival costs." She never let the narrative of triumph replace the reality of loss. Olga's evenings were quieter than her days. She wrote letters late into the night, long, thoughtful responses to strangers who sought her advice. Some confessed their own guilt: soldiers, children of collaborators, people who had kept silent during injustices. She never condemned them. Instead, she wrote, "Guilt is only useful when it leads to empathy. Shame without action is vanity." Her moral clarity was sharp but never cruel. One recurring correspondent was a German student who had discovered his grandfather's SS uniform in an attic. He asked if she could ever forgive people like his family. Olga's reply became one of her most quoted letters: "Forgiveness is not mine to give." The dead are the ones who must forgive. What you can do is refuse to lie about them, tell the truth, teach it. That is how you earn the right to exist among the living. That letter was later printed in German textbooks. When visiting Europe, she often met with young Germans who feared that their generation could never escape inherited guilt. She told them, "You are not responsible for what was done before you were born. You are responsible for what you allow to be done while you live." Her words lifted a weight while placing another: responsibility without despair. That, she believed, was the essence of conscience. Her foundation began funding programs in Eastern Europe to document testimonies still hidden in small towns. Old villagers who had been silent for 50 years finally spoke into microphones, naming names, describing what they had seen. Olga insisted these archives remain open to the public. "Truth should not be kept behind glass," she said. "It should breathe." The project became one of the largest oral history collections in the world. Despite global recognition, she avoided hero worship. She refused awards that came with pomp. When a prestigious university offered to name a lecture hall after her, she declined. "Name it after one who never came back," she said. Her humility was not modesty, it was respect for scale. In her mind, every survivor stood on the shoulders of the dead. "We are tall," she said, "only because they lie beneath us." She kept a small notebook of sentences she never published, reflections too intimate for print. After her death, they were found on her desk. One page read, I used to ask why I lived. Now I ask how I must live to justify it. Another said, the world will forgive too soon. My task is to remind it before it sleeps. These fragments revealed the private side of her mission, not an educator's calm, but a mourner's endurance. By the 1980s, time had blurred the edges of the event she had survived. For many young people, Auschwitz was history, not warning. Olga fought that indifference by confronting modern prejudice directly. She visited communities where new hatreds brewed, drawing parallels without exaggeration. Every era has its uniforms, she said. Sometimes they wear suits instead of boots. The danger is the same. Her calm voice carried more authority than any slogan. At an international conference on genocide prevention, she summarized decades of study in one sentence. Mass murder is never spontaneous. It is always prepared by language. The hall erupted in applause, but she only smiled faintly. Clap for yourselves, she told them. You are the ones who must stop it next time. That mixture of humility and challenge defined her. She never let admiration replace action. Her foundation produced films, study guides, and survivor interviews translated into dozens of languages. Scholars from Asia, Africa, and South America visited her library to learn how societies remember trauma. Olga welcomed them all. She believed that suffering, though specific in form, was universal in warning. We do not own pain, she said. We share it, or we repeat it. This philosophy transformed her from witness of one genocide into teacher against all genocides. In the quiet of her apartment, she still kept the rhythm of the camp without realizing it, waking early, folding her blanket precisely, standing by the window at dawn. Routine was her way of mastering chaos. Yet sometimes, in the first light, she would see smoke rising from factory chimneys across the river and feel her throat tighten. I know they are not burning people, she wrote in her diary, but my body does not. Memory, she knew, lived not only in the mind but in the flesh. In her later years, Olga received invitations from governments and universities around the world. She met presidents, bishops, rabbis, and teachers who quoted her words. Yet she remained wary of ceremony. Do not turn me into a saint, she said once at a conference. Saints are admired, not imitated. I would rather you imitate me. The audience laughed softly, but her eyes stayed serious. To her, remembrance was meaningless without responsibility. She watched with concern as political movements began twisting history, some minimizing the camps, others weaponizing memory for their own agendas. Both are betrayals, she warned. Truth is not property. When denialist publications appeared, she wrote open letters to newspapers, countering their lies with dates, names, documents. She understood that the battle for memory would never end. Every generation, she said, would have to win it again. The questions that haunted her most were not about Nazis, but about neighbors. How could people who once greeted each other at markets turn into informants? How could nurses, teachers, and clerks become instruments of destruction? Her conclusion was both simple and terrifying, because it was easy. Evil is lazy, she said. It requires only obedience. That idea, more than any atrocity, frightened her audiences. It meant that Auschwitz was not a distant monster, but a potential within all societies. During the 1990s, she spoke to a group of medical students about ethics. The topic was close to her heart. She had once been a healer forced to assist in harm. She told them, the oath to do no harm must include silence. When you stay silent before cruelty, you harm by omission. The young doctors listened, uneasy. Science without conscience, she said, is not progress. It is precision applied to pain. Her words would later be quoted in medical ethics courses worldwide. Her final visit to Auschwitz came in 1998, at the age of 89. She walked slowly with a cane, stopping often to rest. The air was cold and still. She touched the barbed wire, now rusted and harmless, and whispered something under her breath, a conversation between the living and the dead. A guide offered to take her arm, but she declined. I entered without help, she said. I will walk out the same. At the ruins of the crematoria, She placed a small stone on the ground. It was a Jewish gesture of remembrance, but she said it was for all victims, not only her own. Pain, she told the guide, is not tribal. A journalist accompanying her asked if she ever hated the guards. Olga paused for a long time before answering. Hatred is sterile, she said finally. It reproduces nothing. I prefer anger. Anger builds, if it is used well. Her distinction between hatred and anger became famous among scholars. She believed anger, directed toward justice and education, was the only moral energy powerful enough to oppose cruelty. In those same years, she worked on a second manuscript, not a continuation of 5 Chimneys, but reflections on survival itself. The pages explored guilt, resilience, and the ethics of memory. She questioned whether humanity learns from pain or merely endures it. We confuse remembering with changing, she wrote. To remember without reform is nostalgia. The manuscript remained unfinished when she died, but fragments were later published under the title Fragments of Light. Friends who visited her in her final decade described her home as an archive disguised as an apartment. Shelves of books, boxes of letters, photographs and clippings filled every corner. On the dining table sat an old enamel bowl from the camp, chipped, rusted, yet clean. She used it for flowers. When asked why, she said, because it once held soup for the dying. Now it holds life. That small act summarized her entire philosophy, transforming the instruments of suffering into vessels of meaning. Her correspondence remained vast. Students wrote essays inspired by her. Parents asked how to teach their children about evil without destroying their innocence. She told them, do not hide evil. Show them that goodness is a choice made each day, not a trait inherited. She often reminded teachers that education is not protection by itself. It is potential, fragile as memory. Every book, she said, is a match. Whether it burns a house or lights a candle depends on the reader. Even as her body weakened, her intellect remained sharp. Visitors described her laughter as quiet but contagious. She enjoyed small jokes, good tea, and conversations about art. But she had no tolerance for cynicism. Cynics, she said, are just cowards pretending to be wise. Her faith in humanity was not naive. It was forged in evidence. She had seen kindness bloom in hell and therefore believed it could bloom anywhere. In 1999, she received an honorary doctorate for her contributions to human rights education. During her acceptance speech, she addressed the students directly. You were born free, she said. Use that freedom to see. She reminded them that ignorance is not innocence and that empathy is not weakness. The opposite of love, she concluded, is not hate. It is indifference. The auditorium rose in silence. No applause, just understanding. After the ceremony, she returned to her apartment, sat by the window, and wrote in her diary, "They listened. That is enough." It was her last public appearance before illness confined her to bed. Even then, she continued to dictate letters. To a young journalist, she said, "When I die, quote me correctly. Say that I was not a saint, but a witness. Saints inspire awe, witnesses demand action." Those were among her last recorded words. As her final winter approached, the rhythm of her days slowed. She no longer left her bed often, yet her mind wandered further than ever. Friends who visited found her surrounded by papers, letters to edit, unfinished essays, fragments of thoughts scribbled on the backs of envelopes. "I am tidying up the past," she said with a faint smile. "I want to leave it in order for those who come after." Her tone was calm, like a nurse preparing a room for the next patient. Outside, the world was changing again. Wars flared on television screens. New refugees fled across borders. Olga watched in silence, her eyes reflecting both recognition and sorrow. "We never learn," she murmured. Yet she did not sound bitter. Instead, she wrote notes for teachers, urging them to show these new conflicts alongside the old ones. "Teach continuity," she wrote. "The geography changes, but the pattern stays the same." Her caregivers often found her awake at dawn, gazing through the window. When asked what she was thinking, she answered, "I am listening." To what? "To the silence between generations," she said, "it is fragile. If it breaks, the echo will return." That poetic clarity never left her. Even in weakness, her words carried precision. Each phrase was an attempt to bridge memory and warning. During those last months, she received hundreds of letters. One was from a young teacher in South Africa who wrote that 5 Chimneys had given her students the courage to confront racism in their community. Another came from Cambodia, where survivors of the Khmer Rouge thanked her for showing that remembrance can heal shame. Olga read each letter slowly, often with tears, and whispered, "Good." Then it was not in vain. Her doctors admired her discipline. Even when pain seized her, she insisted on finishing correspondence. "My body is temporary," she said. "My words are not." On her bedside table lay a photograph of her parents and children. She would touch it lightly and say, "I am still working for you." She did not believe in an afterlife in the traditional sense, but she believed in continuity, each act of kindness, each truthful sentence, extending her family's existence beyond ashes. As her breathing grew weaker, she dictated one final note to her assistant. It read, "Do not make my death a tragedy. Let it be a relay. I have carried memory far enough. Someone else must take it now." Those who heard her say it described the moment as both sorrowful and peaceful. She had spent her entire life ensuring that forgetting was impossible. Now she was ready to rest. Olga Lengyel died quietly in her sleep on April 15, 2001 in New York City. She was 91 years old. No grand funeral followed. She had requested a simple cremation, her ashes scattered in the Hudson River. "Let the water carry me," she had written, as the wind once carried them. Friends and students gathered at the riverbank, reading passages from 5 Chimneys. The current glimmered under sunlight as the ashes touched the surface. Someone whispered, "She is free now," but another replied, "She was never bound." In the days that followed, tributes poured in from around the world. Newspapers called her the conscience of remembrance, a chronicler of compassion, a surgeon of truth. Yet her closest friends knew she would have rejected those titles. She once said, "The moment they call me a symbol, they stop listening to what I'm saying." She wanted readers to act, not admire. Her foundation continued its work, expanding scholarships and educational programs. New generations of teachers trained under her philosophy. Teach empathy through fact, not sentiment. The Memorial Library became a sanctuary for those seeking to understand moral collapse. On the wall above the entrance hung one of her favorite lines, "The opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference." Visitors paused to read it before stepping inside. It was both warning and invitation. Students who entered the library often noticed a small framed quote beside her photograph, "You are the next witness." That sentence had become the motto of her legacy. It reminded every visitor that testimony is not inherited through blood but through responsibility. Anyone who learns the truth becomes accountable for what happens next. Olga's ghost, if such a thing exists, seemed to linger in that idea, gentle, insistent, eternal. Across the years, her name appeared in museums, textbooks, and documentaries. Yet what she left behind was not fame, it was vocabulary. Words like dehumanization, bystander, obedience, and witness gained new weight because she had lived them. She transformed them from abstract terms into living warnings. Her book became part of the moral grammar of the 20th century. Teachers still read her passages aloud, often with trembling voices. Students still fall silent at the image of a mother's lie sealing her child's fate. And always, somewhere, a reader closes 5 Chimneys and stares into space, struggling to understand how civilization can coexist with barbarity. That struggle is precisely what Olga wanted. "Understanding is not comfort," she had written, "it is the beginning of duty." 2 decades after her passing, Olga's influence continued to ripple quietly through the world. Her book, once printed in small batches by an obscure publisher, was now a staple in Holocaust studies. But more than academic circles, it lived in the hands of ordinary readers, nurses, teachers, social workers, people who found in her story both horror and hope. Every few years, a new generation rediscovered 5 Chimneys and wrote to the Foundation, confessing how it had changed the way they saw humanity. One such reader was a young doctor in Poland who volunteered in refugee camps. In a letter to the Foundation, he wrote, "Your book reminded me that healing is not only for the body, it is for dignity. Each patient is a name, not a number." That line echoed Olga's own philosophy, that compassion is not weakness, but the strongest resistance against cruelty. Her legacy expanded beyond remembrance into action. Programs under her name began addressing modern forms of hatred, racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, ethnic cleansing. In workshops, educators used parallels from her story to examine propaganda in contemporary media. "Auschwitz did not start with camps," one instructor quoted her. "It started with words." Those sessions often ended in silence, the same silence that followed her lectures decades earlier, not from disbelief, but recognition. In one of her unpublished essays, Olga had written, "We must learn to recognize the first smoke, not the fire." That line became a guiding principle for early warning initiatives against genocide. Her experience had turned trauma into methodology. She had lived the collapse of morality and spent her life mapping its stages so others might stop it in time. The Memorial Library's archives grew to include testimonies from survivors of newer atrocities: Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur. Each testimony began with a dedication, "In memory of those who had no witness." The structure mirrored Olga's vision, to transform individual grief into collective vigilance. Her philosophy was not about Jewish suffering alone, it was about human responsibility. "The Holocaust," she had said, "is not a chapter in Jewish history. It is a chapter in human history that must not be repeated in any language." Visitors to the library often left flowers at her photograph. Some left notes, simple, handwritten messages. "I heard you. We will remember. You gave us courage." The staff collected these notes in a book titled Echoes. Each note was a small act of continuation, proof that her voice still moved hearts long after her body had vanished into the river. Her story also began to appear in digital form: podcasts, online courses, social media campaigns. Short clips of her voice reading from 5 Chimneys circulated widely. One excerpt, only 20 seconds long, was shared millions of times. "If we stop telling the truth, the ashes will rise again." Teenagers quoted it on their profiles. Teachers played it before lessons on prejudice. Technology had become the new vessel for remembrance, and Olga's message adapted effortlessly. In museums across Europe, exhibitions used her narrative as a spine to connect artifacts. Her words beside photographs of the camp, her sentences etched into glass walls. In one exhibit, visitors walked through a narrow corridor lined with mirrored panels. Above them was written, "It was not monsters who built the chimneys. It was people who forgot how to look in the mirror." The reflection of each visitor completed the message. Academics continued to debate her legacy. Some praised her objectivity, others questioned her use of guilt as moral framework. Olga, were she alive, would have welcomed the argument. "Debate," she once said, "means the story is still alive." For her, disagreement was not disrespect, but proof of engagement. She had no patience for reverence without thought. "If you repeat me without questioning me," she told one interviewer, "you have learned nothing." Her writings influenced even fields she never imagined: psychology, ethics, trauma therapy. Clinicians found in her descriptions of camp behavior a blueprint for understanding survival instincts. Her observation that hope can be both medicine and poison became a central concept in trauma studies. Survivors of natural disasters and wars quoted her lines about endurance. In that way, her reach extended far beyond the Holocaust, into any moment where humanity teetered on the edge of forgetting itself. The story of Olga Lengyel also inspired fiction. Novelists borrowed her clarity of tone, her blend of horror and restraint. Filmmakers recreated moments from her testimony with reverence. But the best tributes, she had once said, were not imitations, but applications. "Do not dramatize the pain," she warned artists. "Translate it into awareness." Many followed that principle, creating works that carried her message without exploiting her trauma. Yet even as her memory grew monumental, there remained something intimate about her story, a single woman's voice against the machinery of annihilation. That intimacy survived every translation, every adaptation. Readers still felt as though she were speaking directly to them, across time and distance, whispering a warning too important to ignore. "I am one voice," she had written, "but behind me stand millions who were denied theirs." Each reader who closed the book became part of that unseen choir. In the end, Olga's life could be measured not by her survival, but by her transformation of survival into service. She did not ask for sympathy, only for vigilance. "Pity," she once said, "looks backward. Responsibility looks forward." Her ashes may have scattered, but her warning solidified into moral law. Every time someone speaks out against cruelty, teaches empathy, or refuses indifference, her work continues. The 5 chimneys she named no longer burn, but their shadows stretch forward, reminding the living what happens when silence becomes comfortable. History, Olga believed, is not a fixed narrative, but a living organism. It breathes through those who study it and dies when ignored. She often compared memory to the heart. It must keep beating, even when painful, or the body of civilization collapses. Decades after her death, her analogy proved prophetic. Across the world, where intolerance stirred again, her name reappeared, quoted in protests, invoked in classrooms, and whispered in documentaries confronting new atrocities. In 2015, the United Nations held a commemoration marking 70 years since the liberation of Auschwitz. Among the speakers was a teacher from New York who had trained under the Memorial Library's fellowship program. Standing before the assembly, she read Olga's words. The horror of the camps was not the absence of God, but the absence of man. The hall fell silent. No music followed, no applause, only the weight of that sentence filling the air. It was as if Olga herself had spoken again, reminding humanity that evil thrives when conscience evaporates. At that same event, survivors from other genocides approached the podium, Armenians, Rwandans, Bosnians. They all echoed her message. Remembrance must be universal. Olga had built a bridge across decades and continents, connecting victims who might never have met. Her philosophy of shared humanity transcended culture. "Pain is multilingual," she once said. "So must be empathy." The Memorial Library, now run by a new generation, continued her work digitally. Interactive archives allowed students to walk virtually through the barracks, guided by Olga's own recorded voice. Artificial intelligence reconstructed her speech patterns so her testimony could answer questions in real time. Some critics worried about technology replacing authenticity, but the foundation maintained her mission: education, not entertainment. Each user who entered the virtual camp was met with the same sentence: "This is not history. This is a warning." Her influence also reached literature again. A new wave of writers drew from her emotional restraint, her refusal to sensationalize. They adopted her belief that the storyteller's duty is not to console, but to confront. In essays and novels, her style became a moral compass: spare, factual, devastating. One critic called it the language of moral precision. Another wrote, "Lengyel's voice reminds us that truth does not need adjectives." Scholars continued to study her sense of guilt, often calling it the theology of responsibility. For Olga, guilt was not self-punishment, but fuel for truth. "If I cannot forgive myself," she said, "let that restlessness keep me awake." Modern psychology found wisdom in that paradox. Guilt as motivation rather than paralysis. Therapists used her words with survivors of war, teaching that guilt can be transformed into testimony, just as Olga had done. In film and theatre, depictions of Auschwitz grew over time, but few captured the stark clarity of 5 chimneys. Directors who met her late in life remembered her warning, "Show less, mean more." She believed that imagination was stronger than images, and that restraint preserved dignity. "If you show everything," she said, "you risk showing nothing." Those words guided documentary filmmakers for decades. Her impact even reached science and ethics. The Nuremberg Code, formed after the war, had already established standards against human experimentation, but medical educators later added her writings to ethical syllabi. She had seen how physicians turned science into cruelty. Her testimony became a moral case study. "We built the scalpel," she wrote, "and forgot that it could cut the soul." That line appeared in textbooks, often underlined by students who sensed its power. Every few years, journalists rediscovered her story. Interviews with scholars and former students kept her memory alive in the media. One article in The Guardian called her the quiet architect of modern remembrance. Another in The New Yorker described her as the woman who turned guilt into guidance. These pieces ensured that her book, though old, never aged. Each new crisis revived her relevance. When news of ethnic persecution appeared anywhere, her words resurfaced. Evil does not retire. It waits for vacancy. Visitors to Auschwitz today can still find her photograph among the exhibits. A woman with sharp eyes and calm posture, her expression neither accusing nor pleading. Beneath it are her words in multiple languages. To remember is to act. That simple sentence encapsulates her mission. She believed remembrance without action was indulgence, and action without remembrance was blindness. The two, joined, formed the moral rhythm of civilization. Her story continued to inspire art. Musicians composed symphonies dedicated to her memory, blending fragments of her spoken voice with violins and choirs. Painters depicted her surrounded by smoke that transformed into doves. Yet the most powerful tributes remained the simplest. A teacher showing 5 chimneys to a classroom, a student pausing over a line and whispering, "Never again." One of the final projects under her foundation's guidance was a global essay competition titled The Fifth Chimney. Students from 50 countries were asked to answer one question: what is your generation's Auschwitz? The essays ranged from climate neglect to political repression, each interpreting her message anew. The winning entry came from a 16-year-old girl in Kenya who wrote, "Our chimneys are ignorance and apathy. They burn quietly, but they kill as surely as fire." The line would have made Olga proud. Her portrait now hangs in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Below it, a small plaque bears her own handwriting. "I am no prophet. I am a witness. The rest is your task." That final challenge ensures that her memory is not a monument but a mission. She had given the world her story. What it does with that gift remains the measure of its humanity. As the 21st century advanced, Olga's message continued to echo across generations. The children of those who had studied under her now brought their own students to remembrance ceremonies, reading her words aloud as if invoking a sacred rhythm. For many, her story became not just a historical account but a personal compass. Teachers described how their classrooms grew quiet when they read her final lines. Silence that was not emptiness, but comprehension. "She taught us," one said, "that memory is not about sadness. It is about responsibility." Universities introduced entire courses inspired by her philosophy, classes on ethical courage, propaganda analysis, the psychology of complicity. Students examined how societies drift toward cruelty and how small acts of kindness resist that drift. Olga's book, once a single survivor's cry, had become a foundation for moral literacy. The course materials quoted her directly. "Obedience without conscience is the beginning of every dictatorship." Those words resonated far beyond the study of history. One remarkable story came from a former soldier who had served in a peacekeeping mission during ethnic conflict. Haunted by what he had seen, he found solace in 5 chimneys. He wrote to the foundation saying, "Her courage to remember gave me courage to speak. I realized that silence is not neutrality, it is consent." His letter was added to the growing archive of people transformed by her work. The archive, once about the past, had become about prevention. In modern classrooms, students often discussed how technology changes remembrance. Digital memory, Olga might have warned, risks becoming temporary, scrolling past rather than sinking in. Educators reminded them of her principle that memory must be lived, not just stored. "If remembrance becomes a post you share," one instructor said, quoting her, "then the next genocide will begin in comments." It was a brutal but necessary truth. Her influence reached beyond the West. In Japan, 5 Chimneys became part of a comparative genocide studies program, where students related her experiences to their own wartime history. In Argentina, activists for the disappeared cited her insistence on documentation. In South Africa, reconciliation committees referenced her line, "Truth heals slower than lies, but it heals." The reach of her voice proved that trauma, when translated into knowledge, knows no borders. The memorial library itself evolved into a digital institution. Virtual exhibits allowed visitors to explore primary sources, photographs, letters, and even Olga's handwritten notes. Each visitor could click to hear her words spoken in multiple languages. The technology team debated whether using her synthesized voice might diminish authenticity, but they concluded that the sound of her words mattered more than the mechanics behind them. "The future must hear her," said the director. "Even if her body is gone, her voice will adapt." At annual Remembrance Days, candles were lit not only for the victims of Auschwitz, but for all who had suffered under systems of hate. Each flame represented a life interrupted. Together they formed a constellation of defiance. Children placed photographs of their ancestors beside the candles, merging past and present in one fragile light. A recording of Olga's voice played softly. "If we let the dead vanish twice, first in life, then in memory, we will have built their graves ourselves." The audience stood still, heads bowed, listening. Her story began to appear in unexpected places, in university ethics pledges, in peace negotiations, even in climate justice movements. Activists drew parallels between moral blindness and environmental neglect. They quoted her line, "The earth too has its chimneys." Some critics argued this stretched her meaning, but others saw it as evolution, her words breathing in new contexts, still warning, still urging action. In the age of misinformation, her lessons grew sharper. The manipulation of truth, once the tool of fascism, had reappeared in subtler forms. Olga's warning that lies repeated become law became a mantra for journalists fighting disinformation. Media organizations cited her as an early prophet of post-truth dangers. "She saw it first," one editor said. "Auschwitz was built on propaganda, not just orders." Her insight proved timeless. The erosion of truth always precedes the erosion of life. Meanwhile, her hometown of Cluj restored a plaque at the site of her former hospital. It bore her name and the simple inscription, "Here she healed bodies before she was forced to heal memory." Locals visited, some unaware of who she was, until guides explained her story. Many left in tears, a few left in silence. The building, once a place of healing, now stood as a metaphor for recovery through remembrance. In one of the final surviving interviews about her, a friend recalled visiting her shortly before her death. Olga had spoken quietly about her fears for the future. "People think knowledge is enough," she said. "It is not. Compassion must be taught like reading, again and again, or we will forget the alphabet of empathy." That phrase, "the alphabet of empathy," became the title of a new educational series for children funded by her foundation. In simple terms, it taught respect, diversity, and courage to speak against injustice. Parents around the world used it as a moral guidebook. Thus, Olga's mission transformed once more, from survivor to witness, from witness to teacher, and from teacher to conscience shared by humanity. Her voice, gentle yet unyielding, continued to whisper the same truth across languages and decades. Remember and act. By the time the new millennium reached its third decade, 5 Chimneys had found its way into nearly every major language. It stood beside works by Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, and Viktor Frankl, voices united not by nationality but by endurance. Each of them had turned survival into testimony, but Olga's tone remained distinct, quiet, clinical, unembellished. She did not dramatize horror, she dissected it the way a surgeon might open a wound to cleanse it. Her restraint made her story timeless. Educators who used her text often remarked on its paradox. Though written in grief, it created resolve. Students left her chapters not hopeless, but vigilant. "She doesn't ask us to cry," one professor said. "She asks us to stay awake." That clarity was the essence of her genius, to show despair without surrendering to it. She taught that knowledge is not a cure for evil, but a defense against its return. The continuing publications of her letters and diaries revealed another side of her, more vulnerable, more introspective. One letter to a fellow survivor confessed, "I envy those who believe in divine purpose. I have only human purpose left, but perhaps that is enough." Another entry, written late at night, read, "The dead taught me one lesson, that love and cruelty can coexist." The task is to make love. Stronger scholars studying trauma called her writings the ethics of endurance. New generations, detached from the war by time, began to reinterpret her words through their own crises. Refugees fleeing modern wars saw themselves in her train scenes. Activists quoted her during protests against discrimination. Psychologists used her story in therapy groups for displaced people. Each application proved her message's elasticity. Though born from one genocide, it spoke to every form of suffering born of indifference. At the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, a young historian read aloud Olga's line, "Evil is not born in darkness. It is cultivated in daylight while good people look away." Her voice trembled as she read, and for a moment the audience of diplomats and survivors became a single congregation bound by silence. Afterwards, a survivor approached her and whispered, "We kept our promise. We remembered." That was all Olga had ever wanted. The Memorial Library expanded its outreach through global partnerships. Its online portal offered lesson plans, survivor testimonies, and virtual workshops for teachers in conflict zones. The foundation collaborated with peace educators in Syria, Yemen, and Myanmar, adapting her principles for regions still bleeding from war. Each new project began with the same mission statement she had written decades earlier: to educate is to prevent. Museums continued to feature her words, etched into steel and glass. In Berlin, a memorial installation projected her handwriting in light across the walls of an underground tunnel. The faint looping letters moved slowly as if breathing. Tourists walked through, reading phrases that appeared and disappeared like thoughts. Indifference is contagious. I am one voice, but behind me are millions. The exhibit ended with her signature. Not stylized, just ordinary, human, real. Her work influenced not only remembrance but governance. Politicians studying civic ethics cited her when drafting educational reforms. A European parliamentary report on combating hate speech began with her quote, "Words build scaffolds, on them the killers climb." It was a poetic warning turned into policy. That transformation, from suffering to legislation, represented the final evolution of her testimony. The woman who once described unspeakable horrors had helped create tools to prevent them. Yet amid all the public reverence, those who truly knew her still described her as humble. She preferred kitchen conversations to conferences, handwritten notes to interviews. She once told a friend, "If they ever build a statue of me, I hope pigeons will cover it. That way, it will stay alive." She despised the idea of being fossilized in marble. To her, remembrance had to move, breathe, argue. "I do not want worship," she said. "I want continuation." Scholars who analyzed her psychological resilience found that Olga's mind had achieved what few survivors managed: integration rather than suppression. She neither denied her pain nor let it consume her. She converted it into narrative order, structure out of chaos. In doing so, she modeled a path for post-traumatic understanding that generations of therapists would later follow. Her life demonstrated that memory, when faced directly, can become meaning instead of madness. Philosophers of ethics cited her often in debates about moral courage. One essay called her the Socrates of atrocity, a thinker who forced humanity to question itself without offering easy answers. She would have disliked the title, yet it captured something true. Her insistence that conscience begins with discomfort. "If your memory comforts you," she had warned, "you are remembering it wrong." By the end of the century, even young people far removed from the Holocaust could quote her. On social media, her words circulated as simple white text on black backgrounds. Silence is complicity. Remembering is a verb. You are the next witness. For millions who would never hold her book, these fragments carried the same force as scripture. They condensed an entire moral universe into sentences anyone could understand. Teachers in diverse communities found her particularly powerful for teenagers. They said her story transcended identity politics, appealing to universal conscience. She never says, "This happened to my people," one teacher observed. She says, "This happened to people." That universality made her message immune to nationalism, to ownership. She belonged to humanity, not history. Every generation rediscovers Olga in its own way. Some see her as a historian, others as a philosopher, others as a moral activist. But in truth, she remains what she always was, a nurse. Even after death, she continues to heal. Not bodies this time, but the moral nerves of civilization. Her words disinfect apathy, cleanse indifference, and stitch empathy back into the wound of humanity. And so the story returns to where it began. Not to the camp, not to the chimneys, but to a single human decision to speak. When Olga first put pen to paper, she had no plan to write history. She wrote to survive her own guilt. Yet that act of writing became something larger than survival. It became witness. Out of the ashes of her family, she built sentences strong enough to outlive her century. 5 chimneys was her way of saying, "This happened. Remember it correctly, or it will happen again." Today, when a teacher opens her book before a class, when a journalist quotes her in defense of truth, or when a student reads her words aloud, Olga lives again. Not as a memory, but as a moral force. Her story does not belong to one nation, one faith, or one tragedy. It belongs to every moment when humanity is tested by power, fear, or indifference. Each time a person refuses to look away from another's suffering, the promise she made in that barrack is renewed. If she could see the world now, a world where denial still whispers, where propaganda still poisons, where refugees still climb onto trains hoping for mercy, she would not be surprised. She knew history never ends. It only pauses between repetitions. Yet she would also see the students, activists, and teachers carrying her words forward, and perhaps she would allow herself a quiet smile. "They listened," she would say. "Then there is hope." For Olga, hope was never naive. It was defiance. Hope meant believing that memory can resist erasure, that words can outlast smoke. She once wrote, "The dead do not need tears, they need continuity." That continuity is now our inheritance. We, the living, are the next witnesses, custodians of her truth. What we do with it determines whether history remains warning or prophecy. When visitors leave Auschwitz today, many turn for one last glance at the gate. Beyond it, ordinary life resumes. Cars, voices, clouds. The sky above the camp is strikingly blue, a cruel contrast because it was the same color when the chimneys burned. Standing there, one realizes that the world itself did not change after Auschwitz. Only our awareness did. And that awareness is fragile, easily lost. Olga's life reminds us to guard it fiercely. In her final pages, she addressed the reader directly. "You who read this, do not pity me. Pity the world that made me possible and change it." Those words remain the essence of her testament, a command disguised as confession. She offered no comfort, only conscience. That is why her voice endures when others fade. The 5 chimneys she described no longer stand, their bricks crumbled by time and war. Grass grows where ashes once fell, birds nest in the cracks of concrete walls, yet the silence of that place still vibrates with her memory. Every gust of wind carries echoes of names, faces, and stories she refused to let disappear. The air itself seems to whisper her refrain, "Remember and act." That is the final image this documentary leaves us with. Not Olga's suffering, but her legacy. A woman once stripped of her identity who rebuilt it from truth. A witness who turned horror into lesson. A nurse who healed not the body, but the conscience of humanity. Her story ends not with death, but with duty, passed from her hands to ours. So as the screen fades to black, her voice returns, calm and unwavering, repeating the line that defines her life. Silence is complicity. To remember is to act.